following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Hi there, everybody. This is Alan Blumkin on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. I'm here with my co-host, David Finoli, and we're going to do another chapter in Pittsburgh sports. Today we're going to discuss David's wonderful book that came out, I believe, last year, right?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. 50 greatest players in Pittsburgh Pirates history. Welcome, David.
Well, thanks, Al. How you doing?
Okay. Now, this book, there aren't that many teams, historians that put out books like this. So I'd like to know how you got the idea and how the process went through.
Well, after I had done the Pirate Encyclopedia, I wanted to do something that focused on just the greatest players. I'd come across a couple other books from the publisher Roman Littlefield, and thought it was in a good format. So I had contacted them to see if they were interested in me pursuing it with them, which luckily they were. And we signed an agreement, and then I went about to look for the rankings of players on a couple different aspects. Obviously, their success they had in Pittsburgh versus the period of time they played in. In essence, Brian Giles had some great stats, but he had some great stats in a heavily offensive era, as opposed to some guys in the dead ball era who might not look as impressive on the surface, but when you compare it to the rest of the league, certainly were successful. So I went about doing that and comparing what not only what they meant to the franchise and their teams, but what they meant to the history of baseball in general, and came up with my 50 list, which seemingly with nobody on the horizon to get in there, seems like it's one that might stick for a while.
I see in the list you didn't put Tommy Leach.
Tommy Leach was.
Oh yeah, he is on. He's number 27. My bad.
Right, I was going to say
okay.
Tommy Leach was close to. He was close to the top 20.
Yeah. You used what kind of methodology did you use?
Well, Tommy Leach.
No, I mean with the book itself.
With the book itself, well, again,
yeah.
Using the players compared to their eras, how many times they led, going through some of the awards they had won. For instance, Kai Kyler certainly didn't have a long career in Pittsburgh, but had 3 MVP worthy seasons. Probably along with Bonds and McCutcheon had what could have been one of the great 3-year spans in team history. So certainly that's why he ended up being included so highly there. But basically, we did a lot of looking towards the way they compared their eras, and certainly what they meant to their teams. Did they help them win? Did they were they pivotal part of winning generations?
Yeah, because I see you basically spread it over, over the decades, including a few pitchers from the 19th century, and specifically you put in Frank Killen.
Oh, Frank Killen was certainly one of the great pitchers of his era and one of the great pitchers in the game. I would venture to claim also one of the great pitchers of baseball in the 19th century.
And I see you basically selected from the first first decade of the 1900s, and most of them were surrounding teams that contended, except of course for the ones in the current era.
Yeah. Well, McCutcheon was kind of special, and while his stats maybe don't look as formidable as some of the players below him, to me, he certainly was in there for two reasons. He was in there, A, because obviously he helped lead a franchise out of 20 years of disastrous play, and again, in his 3-year period, he could have won easily 3 MVP awards, which certainly no player had done. And as I said before, only in my mind, Kyler and Bonds had similar 3-year experiences where they were among the best in the game and could have swept, especially Bonds, could have easily swept all 3 MVPs.
And of course, the all-time top, which I agree with you, was Honus Wagner, who was, especially in the National League, which was a much more difficult league to hit during the first decade than the American League was. And Wagner was so far above in the National League, whoever was the next player from his era, that there's absolutely no room for comparison.
No. I mean, you're talking about a guy who won 8 batting titles, 4 RBI titles, was probably one of the better home run hitters of his era, in an era where you rarely hit home runs. But when you look at Honus Wagner, you're looking at a guy that many of the so-called experts rate as one of the top 10 players in the history of the game. And I think certainly is well considered the greatest shortstop. It was kind of comical a few years ago when people were trying to talk about Derek Jeter in the same breath as Honus Wagner. Derek Jeter was great, no doubt, but Derek Jeter wasn't even in the same conversation with Honus Wagner, who also, from all accounts, would have been the best first baseman defensively. He played there a little bit, would have been the best outfielder. This guy basically excelled wherever you put him and led the Pirates in their greatest era. I mean, there is no era in Pirate baseball that can compare to 1900 through 1909. And,
also, I mentioned this on Facebook a couple of times. He and John Henry Lloyd, who was playing in the Negro Leagues at that time, still 100 years later, after they played their last games, are still considered the best shortstops ever.
Absolutely. That's a great point out.
And, I noticed that also that, given the Pirates' problems with pitching over the years, that the first pitcher you listed was Babe Adams at 10.
Babe Adams was considered one of the great control pitchers of all time. Here's a guy who, as an older rookie in the league, he started with St. Louis in 1906, played a bit role with the Pirates in 1907, and at 27 years old when he came here, did not look like the pitcher he ended up being. 1909, he has a phenomenal rookie season at 12-3, a 1.11 ERA. Fred Clark surprisingly calls on him to start the 1909 World Series. Legend has it that National League President John Heidler suggested he start Adams that day because he reminded him of a pitcher with Washington named Dolly Gray who was very successful against the Tigers. Whether that was correct or not, we don't know, but certainly one of the reasons might be that Adams was just his best pitcher down the stretch in September, and it certainly was one of the great managerial calls in Pirate history as he ends up winning 3 games in the series, and is in a series that should have been dominated by Cobb and Wagner. This guy turns out to be the MVP. His career, he has the 21st greatest, lowest whip in Major League history, 18th best bases on balls per innings pitched. He once throws 21 innings without giving up a walk against the Giants, a game he unfortunately lost. But, this guy is by far the best control pitcher in Pirate history, and certainly, I'm not sure he's a Hall of Famer, but he certainly deserves in the conversation in my eyes.
And one of the things that struck me is you put Bob Friend 23rd. His overall record was, not that great. He was 197 and 230.
Right, and with the Pirates, he wins 191 of those games. But to me, Bob Friend, many people argue that the one-loss record is one of the most overrated things in baseball history. And with Bob Friend, he's certainly an example of that. Where when the Pirates were bad in the mid-50s, early to mid-50s, Bob Friend, one of the better pitchers in baseball. In 55, he wins an ERA title, I believe the first ERA title to be won by a man on a last place team. Pitches great in 56 and 57, although he's 4 games under 500 during that time. So a lot of that comes, and he does have one bad season where he admitted later on, I believe he was out of shape and
1959
coming off a 22 win season. In 58, probably his head was a little big. He was only 28 years old, but he was 8-19 in 59. But again, rebounds with a phenomenal 1960 campaign. But if you look at his secondary stats and what he meant to that team, to me, there was no denying that Bob Friend is a guy that really belongs in this list.
Yeah, he was never injured. I remember him never spending any time on the disabled list.
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. He had a tremendous record of durability with the team, something that you rarely, if ever, see anymore.
Oh God! I mean, the way they do things now, 200 innings is a workload.
Yeah, exactly.
It's insane.
I was just thinking that this year. I was listening to, I had a couple of errands this morning, and on my way home, I'm listening to MLB radio on Sirius, and they're discussing teams like Seattle had 17 starters last year. The Angels, I believe they said 16 starters, and that just, you need any more 9 or 10 solid starters to get through a season, and that just was not the way it used to be at all.
No, now the teams are carrying, for the most part, 13 pitchers.
Yeah.
Which leaves you with a 4-man bench.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
it really affects. There was one game, Yankee game last year where Girardi was running out of pitchers. I moved this pitcher that was in there to first base for a play.
Yeah.
And then after one batter, they brought him back in.
Yeah, it's very very imperative that they have to do things like that at this level, and probably to me one of the reasons they talk seriously about doing, in my estimation, some idiot things to get through an extra inning game. Because there are no benefits.
We discussed that in the podcast I did last night. That, I mean, my position was I don't care whether it's all-star game or exhibition games, because they need more awards of Dizzy Dean. They don't count none, but they can't they can't do this in the regular season.
No, I mean, you end up and you do things where a shootout is exciting in hockey. Don't get me wrong; it's just a stupid way to end a game on a skills competition.
Well, that's the way they do it in soccer.
Yeah.
And
it's okay to have ties in things like that, but in baseball, you need to play till the game ends. And that's what they need to do, and quit thinking about putting a guy on second to begin after the 12th inning.
Yeah.
Just ridiculous.
Could you talk a little bit about another favorite of mine who nobody knows about, Wilbur Cooper?
Wilbur Cooper he's the winningest
I know
player in Pirate history. He is the only Pirate ever to win 200 games, and certainly was a guy who came up in 1912, pitching a clutch game. I believe the Pirates ended up in second place that year, but he pitches a clutch game and goes on to just be a wonderfully consistent pitcher through what wasn't a great era of Pirate baseball in the mid to late teens. 1920, he wins 20 games for the first time at 24. A year later, he leads the league at 22. And then in 1924, he again wins 20 games, but he's a bit of an irritable player, and ends up getting traded right before the season begins to the Cubs, and goes along with the great Hall of Famer Rabbit Moranville, who also wasn't necessarily a good team player, and the Pirates end up picking up three parts, Vic Aldridge, actually two parts, Vic Aldridge and George Grantham. Al Niehaus really wasn't an important part of their 1925 championship team. So Cooper, who goes all these years pitching with the Pirates, ends up missing out on the World Championship because of that. But make no mistake, I mean, Wilbur Cooper was certainly a guy who many wonder why he's not talked about for inclusion in the Hall of Fame. But
I saw you ranked Elroy Face very high.
Elroy Face.
I'm one of the people that thinks that, of course, this probably will never happen, that he should get into Cooperstown.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, here's a guy who was I don't want to say a failed starter. I mean, he was an okay starter on some bad teams, but he comes in, makes the switch to the bullpen, becomes really one of the first modern day specialists in the game, and through the late 50s, 59, I believe it was, he goes 18-1, won 19 consecutive games. And he often considers that not one of his better years because, obviously when a reliever wins a lot of games, at times they're blowing leads. But he's a tremendous pitcher, probably the best pitcher in relief pitcher in Pirate baseball history. 186 saves during his time period, where saves were not a common occurrence. Pitches masterful in the for the most part in the 60 series. I believe he gets 3 saves in there, if I'm not mistaken. And ends up in 68. He gets traded to the Tigers, and he needed one more game to set the all-time National League record for games. And Steve Blass starts a game. Roy Face has been traded, but hasn't left yet. So Blass, I believe, goes into the field. Face pitches quickly, and then Blass comes back in, and then Face goes to Detroit so he can set the record, which was kind of a neat story. But bar none, he and his screwball deserve high on this list and deserve into Cooperstown, in my estimation.
One of the positions the Pirates have been traditionally strong at has been shortstop. And here you've got Wagner, followed by Archie Vaughan, followed by Glenn Wright, and Glenn Wright is after Dick Roth. So there are 4 shortstops in there that essentially covered, has been a very, very productive position for the Pirates.
Well, Archie Vaughan is, to me, glad he's in the Hall of Fame, deservedly so. One of the most underrated shortstops in Major League history. He holds the Pirate record for I believe, hit 385 to set the Pirate single season hitting record. But he ends up just being a tremendous 10-time or 8-time Hall of Famer. He hits a great home run in the 41 All-Star game. Or he hits 2 home runs in that game, if I'm not mistaken. But he ends up hitting 385 and 35. He has just a tremendous OPS of almost 1.1. He finishes third in the MVP race. But he ends up getting traded to Brooklyn, and like Clemente, he wears the number 21 for the Pirates, and he dives in trying to save somebody who drowned in a guy went over and drowned in a fishing accident.
Yeah.
And Archie Vaughan dives in to try to save him. I guess not much of a swimmer himself, and ends up drowning himself. So it makes it, if you add Michel Briere, the Penguin who wore 21, who died tragically in an auto accident, it makes 21 probably the unluckiest number in Pirate history.
One of the ones that really surprised me is your last chapter on Jason Bay. Well, he came here. After leaving, he left Boston, where he was hit very well, to come here to the Mets, and he was a total disaster with them.
Oh yeah, yeah. He ends up having a nice time in Boston, but for the Pirates, I mean, it's a 6-year career. It's not a long career, but he hits 139 homers in those years. He ends up just being a phenomenal pickup from San Diego. And he pretty much, in my eyes, along with Brian Giles, becomes one of the great figures in an era of Pirate baseball that wasn't good. He hits over 100 RBIs twice for him, consistently in the high 20s to mid 30s in home runs. Becomes the face of the Pirates. He's their all-star. He wins the Rookie of the Year award, which ends a long run of Pirate history where they didn't win an official. They won a couple Sporting News Rookies of the Year, but they never won an official one.
You referenced that, yeah.
The
one that really bothered me was Steve Sachs over Johnny Ray.
Yes, exactly. Johnny Ray had a phenomenal rookie year coming over from Houston, and I agree with you. I thought certainly deserved that one, but Jason Bay was to me, certainly somebody who deserved in this list, he ends up being somebody who ends up being one of the great trades in the 20-year bad streak. He comes with Oliver Perez from San Diego. Oliver Perez, who had some years with the Pirates, and if I'm not mistaken, was still hovering around in a bullpen.
Oliver Perez is still getting paid.
Yeah.
I'm a lefty
He was
special.
with Washington last year. Yeah. So, but he was a pretty good starter with the Pirates during his time here. But Jason Bay is certainly he and Giles to me are along with Kendall probably the three Pirates that I think.
Did you consider Fred Sanchez at all?
I'm sorry.
Did you consider Freddie Sanchez at all?
I didn't. I mean, he wins a batting title, and he ends up, if I'm putting a top 100, he's probably battling for that one of those last 5-6 spots. But to me, Sanchez was a good hitter, but not a good productive hitter, if you know what I mean. I mean, he got a lot of hits, but certainly I wouldn't classify him as productive in any shape or form. when compared to the top 50 Pirates. But nonetheless, a good career here.
And one of the other things that struck me was Dick Groat being below War and Friend, which that surprised me. Dick Groat wasn't no. I'm saying he's not one. I'm saying he's one of the all-time greats, but I thought his career was on the Pirates was better than War and Friend.
And again, that's you got to realize, as I tell everybody when I do this, when you're comparing, these guys, there's not a real huge difference between. I mean, you can make an argument for a lot of these guys between probably Clarence Beaumont and Wilbur Cooper. A lot of these guys can be interchangeable, and Groat certainly was a great player for the Pirates. I mean, he hit over 300 three times. He wins an MVP award, although I'm not sure, in my mind, he was a best player in the league at that point, especially missing all of September. But again, I felt he was a guy who was good, but like Sanchez, might not have been as productive a hitter from an overall standpoint. I mean, he looks like with Pittsburgh, he never really tops 800 in an OPS. And
I know he had very little power. Yeah.
Right, and he was a very good fielder, not an exceptional one, but a very good one. So I kind of looked at him as a guy who I never really considered one of the top players at his position in the league, whereas, there were periods of time where Law and Friend were certainly the top players in the league. I mean, I know he won in 60, but if you look at that list of players behind him, there were players with a lot better years, and quite frankly, being out the full month, Clemente might have been a guy who, when I know he was frustrated finishing 8th in that race, but he might have been a guy I would have said is more valuable if you're picking from a champion than Groat might have been that year. But again, I consider Groat one of the top 25 players in history. So, when you're getting to that point, you're in my eyes, you're looking at things like that, trying to look down who's a better considered a better player at his position at that point.
Yeah, one of the positions the Pirates have traditionally had trouble with has been catcher. I noticed in the book that the top catcher you have at number 34 is Manny Sanguillen, and the only other two that you put in there was Jason Kendall at 44 and Tony Pena at 46. Right,
and I mean, Sanguillen could have been up higher had he not fallen after his friend Clemente's death, which I do think kind of contributed to him going from the level he was at to where he ended up. But until that point, if you look back, I have a very extensive library in my office, and I like to look back at what these players were thought about in previews before the season. And oftentimes, Sanguillen and Clemente were, or Ian and Johnny Bench were talked about with Bench not being significantly better than Sanguillen. They were always talked about as the best two catchers in the game. And unfortunately, he kind of slipped at that point. But he certainly still goes down as one of the greats, and has a clutch hit in Game 2 of the '79 series when he comes back from Oakland, which was a good way to really end his career. Kendall, had he not been injured,
might have
ugly.
It was. That was very ugly, yeah.
and quite frankly, his attitude got a little ugly towards the end of his career here, which understandably so with all the losing. And Tony Pena, a good hitter, but certainly one of the great, if not the greatest, defensive catcher in modern Pirate history.
And did you ever consider a couple of names I want to throw at you if you ever considered them? One is Bob Veal.
Bob Veal, yeah. Bob Veal makes, again, would be in the probably 75 to 80 range if I'm doing it. He was certainly a dominant pitcher in the 60s, but his dominance ended fairly quickly.
I always thought
he
he could have been a lot better than he was.
Oh yeah. I mean, you look at Veal during those clutch days. I mean, he ends up winning over 100 games in a very pitcher-friendly era, and you look at him probably 64 to 67, especially in 64 and 65. One of the premier strikeout pitchers in the game, if not the premier strikeout pitcher. And there were many stories of probably the one guy that people were most afraid of facing. He had those big glasses, and I think it was Lou Brock, I can't remember, always said, he was more afraid of him than anybody else, especially when it rained, because Veal, wanting to intimidate people, would leave the glasses on fogged. And that certainly was intimidating, but his star was not there for a long enough period of time to make the top 50, probably.
And what about George Gibson, who I believe was the dead ball catcher back in the
He was. The thing that got him, and again, he certainly is in the top 100 Pirates of all time. He's not a great offensive player by any stretch of the imagination. He has a couple good years, but he is the quintessential along with Tony Pena. I mean, he did it over a long period of time than Pena, but certainly, would rate with Pena as the top defensive catcher in Pirate history. But the thing that knocks him a little, and he ends up having a decent managerial career too, but the thing that knocks him down a little bit would probably be his offensive prowess, which again, even at the time was not considered impressive.
Do you have any idea whether, looking at the present team, the present era, last couple of years, whether there's anybody that's playing now that potentially has the ability to crack the top 50?
2 years ago, I thought Cole had the potential to.
Yeah.
Marte has the talent to, but Marte has not in any way, shape, or form performed consistently to that potential level. So he's going to have to put together some monster years at this point to be considered, but he's not a guy that I would even probably put much past consideration for the top 100. He's got top 50 potential for sure, but he's very undisciplined, and he ends up being a good player, but not a great one. And overall, if you look down at it, probably if Bell can move in on what he showed his rookie year, there's a guy that might have potential down the road. But the problem with the modern player, to be honest, is they're here for such a little amount of time anymore that as compared to the pre-free agency days, you really have to make a huge impact in a short period of time, like McCutchen did.
Okay, and I'd like to bring up Dave Parker. There's been a thread on Facebook that I've seen. I didn't comment on that about Dave Parker being a Hall of Famer. I thought he had, in 77 and 78, he was the best player in the National League and maybe all of baseball. But he stuffed the Hall of Fame up his nose.
Yeah, what I'd like for Dave Parker is, and finally this year they seem to have given it to him, is some serious consideration. To me, he deserves more serious consideration than an Alan Trammell. Not to say Trammell's not a Hall of Famer, but if he is, certainly Parker deserves a little more consideration than he got. But he did thumb his nose at the Hall of Fame, and in his latter days in Pittsburgh, drugs got the best of him. And unlike what happens today, with performance-enhancing drugs, back then it was cocaine, and cocaine was not good to his career. I mean, arguably it cost him 3,000 hits. It could have cost him 400 homers, things that get you in the Hall of Fame. But if you look at Parker's Pittsburgh career, I mean, my gosh, you're right. In 77 and 78, he was the best player in the game. Wins the award in 78, and he has an arm that rivals only Clemente in team history. He makes 2 throws in the 79 All-Star game that, I mean, you just open your eyes and shake your head. The only guy to win an All-Star game award because of his arm. Probably one of the biggest controversies going back here was going back and forth with Bonds and Parker. When I was doing the encyclopedia with Bill Rainier, he had we had reversed this and in the first one and more thinking more of Bond's 3-year stretch between 90 and 92. But when I went back in retrospect and looked at it, Parker's total career here was better. He played 11 years. He hits 305. He's one of the dominant players for 3 or 4 years like Bonds was. But outside of those years, Bonds' rest of his resume in Pittsburgh was not as impressive in my eyes that Parker's was, which is why I put Parker, snuck him ahead of him.
Yeah, Parker also had the distinction of having to replace Roberto Clemente.
Right.
Which I'm sure didn't help very much, yeah.
No, yet he did it. He did it in an incredible way. I mean, there was not only little drop off, there was no drop off. Clemente in his later years, certainly still playing well, but not playing as much. And Parker having a rare combination of being a great average hitter as well as just showing some incredible power to boot. It
was not like
he was remarkable.
Yeah. Last night we got into I brought up Wally Moon, who just passed away the other day, and one of the things I said about him is that he came to St. Louis having to replace Slaughter.
Yes.
They had gotten rid of the Cardinals, and he was booed for the first half of the season because he wasn't Slaughter. And then when he showed he could play, they let up on him. Yeah. No, certainly it's always tough to come after a legend, especially one who passes away the way Clemente had. There's been arguably, we've had some good right fielders since then, but still nobody's ever going to be able to measure up to the man that has more things named after him in this country than the U.S. president. Yeah, that's for sure. Also, another one that that I thought might have been a little bit higher was Al Oliver.
Al Oliver, again, there's another guy who goes back and forth with, talking his career as a whole with Hall of Fame consideration. I know Bill James, at least in his earlier writings and in the earlier part of the 21st century, in his abstract in his book about the Hall of Fame, is a big proponent of Oliver getting in there. A guy who has 2,700 hits, who was a consistent 300 hitter over the course of his career. To me, he was a guy here who maybe didn't have the monster season, but man, over the course from 1970 on down to when he left before the 78 season, he was always just consistently good. A guy who was consistently in the 300s and up but would give you great double power. I mean, he hits 38, 39 doubles, high teens to 20 homers. He's fast enough to get you triples, and certainly always getting MVP votes during his time here. So he's a guy who's here, whereas Bonds might be there because of his peak. Oliver, I really believe, was a top 30 player because of his consistency throughout his career here.
Well, now, one of the things that's going to make it fairly hard to do books like this with current day references that you don't find very many players hanging around the particular team for that long.
No, which is why it is going to be difficult for a man to crack a top 50 in a list in a career in a career during a particular franchise. He's going to have to just do what McCutchen did and just be around among the best in the game to make it to that level.
Okay, fine. Okay, I want to thank you for this. I want to recommend the book to anybody who's interested. And David, can you tell people where it can be picked up?
You can find it at your local Barnes & Noble in the area, but you can definitely get a better price if you go on Amazon, which I always like to recommend because certainly have great service, and
that's where I got mine.
Every book you need.
That's where I got mine. Also, are you working on anything right now?
I have just finished my manuscript on a book. It's called Classic Pittsburgh: The Greatest 50 Collegiate Games in Pittsburgh History.
Both football and basketball?
It's 99% football and basketball.
Yeah.
I had a couple of hockey games in there from some of the newer Division I teams, but Pitt football dominates it. Carnegie Tech football has quite a few in there. Duquesne basketball's in there. A couple of the Pitt basketball games. But it's been just a fun project to go back and look at things as one of the great upsets, for example, Carnegie Tech defeating Newt Rockne and Notre Dame, a game that Newt Rockne was so confident he was going to win, he stayed back to watch Army-Navy and let his assistant coaches do the coaching. They end up losing that game 19-0. And, even looking back at a couple in Pitt's national championship run in the 70s, it was just fun going back and reliving some of those great moments.
Do you have a release date yet for this, or does it take a while to go through the process?
It's going to take a while. I would probably estimate a release towards Christmas of this year. I just finished it. I'm right now going through the editing process, going through and rereading the chapters once again and editing them, and then should have it off to them within the next week or two, and we'll probably hopefully see it by next October or November in time for Christmas.
Okay, I want to thank you very much. As a longtime Pirate fan, this has been pretty educational for me, and I appreciate the book, and I appreciate you coming on to talk about this today.
Not a problem.
Okay. Take care, and we'll pick up another topic in the next week or two.
You got it, Al.
Okay, you take care.
Talk to you then.
Bye-bye.